Okay.
Please.
So now, do you see the presentation mode? Yes, thank you. So first of all, thank you very much for having invited me to the second round of the ARVA lectures on the archaeology of the Caucasus. And with the topic on bioarchaeology in the Caucasus and beyond, and I will not speak only about the North Caucasus, new results and perspectives. And of course, I will present today the results of many people who excavated the sites, who worked in the labs, who presented all this stuff. And my name is here first, but I want to thank at the beginning and also at the end to everybody who has contributed to this work, which is in fact the result of the last 15, if not 20 years. So I will talk today about the current state of art of bioarchaeological studies in the Caucasus. And let's no, okay. In recent years, new methodological approaches and new research objectives have generated surprising discoveries. Even the Caucasus is always good for surprise. Many of these studies showed and clearly revealed the Caucasus as a key region in many respects. You see it here in the middle. On one hand, the mountains bridge the regions of to the south and to the north, and so integrate Western Asia and Eurasia and Europe. On the other hand, regional characteristics exist and that are only, let's say, taking part in the mountain zone. So my aim is to give an overview about the rather young history of bioarchaeological research in these areas, highlight some of the recent outcomes, and in the end, finally, outline some future directions that this can take. Before I, however, address the objectives that have guided bioarchaeological studies in the Caucasus so far, let me take a step back and address the relationship of archaeology and the archaeological sciences in their epistemology, because it's not always an easy marriage. In a presentation for a conference on the archaeology of the 21st century in Moscow in 2019, which we all, and this is a very big all, imagined to be very different from what we are experiencing currently, I raised the question of whether bioarchaeology is still a part of the humanities in the 21st century, or has it not long ago become a field of its own, with own topics, with own studies, with own researchers, and with own journals. Well, in the early 2000s, a new dynamic got momentum in the natural sciences associated with archaeology, and this is in fact the result of it. And computer-aided statistical analysis opened the field for big data. This advance in technology is considered as a third scientific or science revolution, for instance, by Christian Christiansen, as you can see here. And one can doubt about many things that Christiansen writes, but here he is very right. However, in 2015, paleogenetics provoked a first outcry among archaeologists when these two studies were published based on genome-wide data from Europe and Eurasia, not very much, but nevertheless. And both postulated extensive migrations in the Bronze Age on the basis of genetic admixture with different regional vectors. Suddenly, statements were at the table that thoroughly questions archaeological paradigms. For instance, migrations were not very popular at that time. But moreover, they threatened that means archaeologists' hegemonial claims in studying the illiterate past. Archaeology is an academic field with a somewhat ambiguous position between natural sciences and the humanities. Operating with the leftovers of human creativity, that means shaping matter into artificial objects, artifacts, buildings, or something else, and with the remains of the humans and their animals by themselves, but without any written manifestation as to their age or meaning, the study of the illiterate illiterate human past had to clutch at any possible methodological straw in advance to become a serious field of study. Our methods developed from and developed together with natural scientific disciplines such as geology, biology, taxonomy, or medicine. Nevertheless, past people were past people, and thus they were considered as a basic subject of the historical disciplines. It is this uneasiness, this substantial gap in academia between natural sciences and the humanities, which we are all experiencing, and without going further into details, the differences in concepts, methods, language, and understanding of knowledge in science and humanities are different, and they are not easily communicated, and they are also not easily bridged. They determine, however, our cooperation and also the output of our respective or also the joint research. And having said so much, what can we learn from bioarchaeological studies or excavating the DNA, the result of ancient diets, diseases, or physical activities? Ancient DNA studies have sometimes very high questions or high approaches as to what they can answer. This is a quote from David Reich in 2018, which in fact liberate archaeologists from their work. And you hear from me that I see that rather critical, but nevertheless, we have to deal with that. The methodological preliminary remarks seem to me necessary in order to assess the significance, but also the limitations of bioarchaeological studies, and to probably place them in the long and complicated cultural history of this region. So let me have a first glance on some of the methods and their pathways into the Caucasian archaeology. Traditional methods of bioarchaeological research, such as botany, zoology, physical anthropology, and so on, go back to the beginning of the exploration of the Caucasus in the 18th and 19th centuries, such as Rudolf Virchow or, for instance, Nikolai Vavilov's work on the botanic basis of Caucasian cereals. Pioneering work in modern bioarchaeology, however, first involved stable isotope studies. In 2006 and 8, first strontium oxygen measurements from Caucasus, South Caucasus sites were edited by Corinna Knipper together with a very big compendium of animal bone studies from the same sites, spearheaded by Margarete and Hans-Peter Urbmann. In the same years, 2007 and 8, Natalia Shishlina discussed first radiocarbon nitrogen data from the Caspian steppe to investigate pastoral diets and radiocarbon offsets. She edited in the following years a majority of the data available today north of the Caucasus, and likewise initiated research, multi-proxy research using phytoliths, pollen, macrobotanic remains to study the seasonality of burials, which is in fact a multi-proxy approach which has remained singular and unparalleled until today. She gave a lecture on her own research in the last round of ARVA papers, so I don't have to go into the details here. A third pioneering group was led by Tom Heim and Andrei Belinsky, which targeted radiocarbon reservoir effects, but also included a first isotope study, and you can see it here, here in this image. Well, the aim of these early studies was to better grasp the subsistence of steppe and pitman pastoralists via their diets. What these studies, however, did was they demonstrated that the stable isotope analysis for reconstructing dietary patterns, which was at that time developed mainly in Europe for sedentary agricultural groups, could be well applied to the mobile groups of the Eurasian Bronze Age. In the meantime, isotope studies have considerably increased. Different teams are working both in the North and the South Caucasus, and also, of course, beyond the Bronze Age timeframe. The analytical spectrum has also widened by a growing number of sequential strontium, oxygen, and carbon measurements, which I will not address today. But I've seen Hannah Chesin in the audience, who just recently has edited here a large data set on this. Well, the other important field in Caucasian bioarchaeology is paleogenetics. After several studies on modern Caucasian populations and their haplogroups, which are still going on, which are very heavily discussed, some initial approaches on mitochondrial DNA, for instance, by Balanovsky, Yusunubayev, or Haber in 2011 to 16. A first study of 45 genome-wide sequenced individuals from the North Caucasus and a neighboring steppe in 2019 demonstrated the complexity of the Bronze Age population. This study was spearheaded by our team and together with the Max Planck Institute at Jena at that time, Wolfgang Haag, and it is published by Xiaoxia Wang as first author. They revealed, moreover, a clear-cut or clear dividing line, which is located somewhat north of the Great Caucasus mountain ranges. And it was also a surprise for us because we also at that moment thought that the watershed of the Caucasus, Great Caucasus, might be a border. The South Caucasus was and is still much less investigated. I hope that will soon change, with only a handful of individuals in recent studies. The world of paleogenetics, however, has long since moved beyond humans and also their domesticates to include the evolution of diseases such as plague, hepatitis, or salmonellosis, and we will come back to this later. And finally, and of course, these are not all methods that can be applied, but I am limited also in time. Finally, proteomic studies, that means the investigation of past proteins, open up even more detailed insights into the nutritional structure of humans and animals. These studies enable to identify a number of proteins such as beta-lactoglobulin or alpha S1 casein and others, which are part of milk and milk products and are preserved in dental calculus. They can inform, in fact, about the consumption of milk and milk products and as well as on the animal species where the initial milk stem from. And together with microbiological and isotope chemical analysis of vessel contents, proteomic research is currently, perhaps, at least for me, the most exciting field in the question of the development of prehistoric modes of subsistence. The second, but we have seen a little bit about the methods, and now let's have a look on the major research issues that are governing the application of these methods in the archaeology of the Caucasus. Landscape. Okay, so I'm a little bit, yeah. As an archaeologist, no, okay, this has shifted. Sorry, okay, we are here with the genetics. Okay, okay. As an archaeologist, I am very happy to be part of these studies. However, the methods are rather complex and they are also widely beyond my expertise. I am not a natural scientist. So the methodological part is left to the specialists, and several of the specialists such as Wolfgang Haag and Ayşe Gelici or Natalia Shishlina has already presented here in the ARVA lectures, and I hope that the others may follow. So my talk will be the perspective of an archaeologist, and I will try to integrate the information from these bioarchaeological proxy data into the ongoing archaeological debates. Most of the evidence presented here is the result of many years of bioarchaeological research, which I started first with landscape archaeology in Kislovodsk together with Dmitry Korobov and Andrei Belinsky, but then it was transformed also in several EU-funded research programs and projects, spearheaded among others by Sven Hansen, myself, and Andrei Belinsky. And I thank everybody in his team or in their teams for the possibility to work in collaboration and with these fantastic materials. What are the major research questions? Migration. Migration was at the core of most early paleogenetic studies in Eurasia, and that concerns also the Caucasus. For the beginning, migration was the most obvious and easy at hand explanatory model. for explaining the fusion of different biological components in the human genome using comparatively simple models, but very sophisticated biomathematical tests in testing hypotheses on biological interrelatedness. This is a big problem, and I will not go into the detail, but for the Caucasus, the question was at what part does the Caucasus play in the formation of the Yamnaya culture, which was at that time thought to have spread the steppe ancestry together with the Indo-European languages from somewhere in the north of the Caucasus into Europe. And the Caucasus was in fact also discussed as one of the homelands of the Indo-European languages. I will not speak about Indo-Europeans further, but migration was of course one of the triggers to study paleogenomics in the Caucasus. Another issue was the population genetics was the marked divide between North and South that is evident in contemporary populations. So the historical depth of these and the cause of this divide is much discussed. So when the Caucasian Bronze Age genomes started to be investigated, the questions were, when and how did the genetic diversity of the Caucasus observed today emerged? To understand the means which Europe and the Eurasian steppe zone and the earliest urban centers in the Near East connected, and to trace the formation of the steppe ancestry profile and check whether it was influenced by farming groups from the south, so that from the Caucasus, or from any other areas in Eastern Europe. The formation of and transformation of pastoral economies was a second, or is still a second major issue in the adaptation of bioarchaeological studies. The mobile pastoralism is maybe the most important aspect for the opening of the Eurasian steppe as a habitat, and it is quite closely related to the introduction of grassland adapted animals such as sheep, goat, and cattle into the steppe area, coming out from their original domestication centers in the Near East, or the Fertile Crescent. However, not only the opening of the steppe by early pastoralists is of interest, but in the 2000s, both in the North and in the South Caucasus, highly complex settlement systems were developed that obviously based on semi-stationary herd management practices and therefore pastoral economies were not only interesting for the beginning of the pastoralism in this area, but also about its transformation into highly efficient economic systems. So what is going on about migration? When we look at the historical interpretation of Caucasian topics, migration plays a role basically in the Neolithic and in the Bronze Age. The introduction of the Neolithic into the Neolithic lifeways, the Shomu-Tepe-Shulaveri culture into the South Caucasus is thought, still debated, but is thought to be related to some kind of migration. The development of the Mycop culture in the North Caucasus was for a long time discussed as a result of a migration in the final stages of the Uruk expansion, and of course the chronological vectors of the Kura-Araxes cultural tradition likewise argues, and this is the next well-known Bronze Age migration, for the division or diffusion of people related to these cultures. The arguments were usually similarities in material culture, but do the pots, let's say the material culture and the cultural traditions, really equal people? Does migration of large population played a role in that? And what was moving the population, the entire population, singular groups, ideas or combinations of different things. Paleogenetics, however, can provide few answers on the immigration scenarios of the Neolithic. This was found out in a paper by headed by or published by Eleni Skurtanianotti. I'm sorry to pronounce her name probably wrong. Because the genetic homogeneity, which resulted from the admixture of Iranian, Caucasian, and Levantine hunter-gatherer ancestries, predate the Neolithic sites in the South Caucasus. So when Neolithic lifeways were introduced at about 6000 BCE to the South Caucasus, they were associated, or must have been associated, with a population which was already transformed and admixed, so and with a genetic profile that continued for very long. So we will not see the immigrants. This is different in the north, as you can see here. Here we can see two clearly defined genetic ancestry profiles without going into the details. One related to the mountains, which are the more or less red and orange dots, and one in the steppe. The mountain shares the same genetic layout in the populations of the South Caucasus, Anatolia or northern Mesopotamia, as few as they are. The steppe ancestry is radically different. The second surprising finding was that this difference was not or did not dissipated over time. Individuals with these fundamentally different ancestry components continued into the late second and first millennium BC. That means this divide was stable for nearly about 3000 years, and nobody yet has a good explanation for that. Groups with the southern ancestry compositions are recorded since the 5th millennium BC in the in the North Caucasus. They are archaeologically belonging to the Dargvoti Meshoko or a culture, or the culture, Neolithic culture with pearl ornamented pottery. They have links to the Sionitsopi horizon in the south, and they are the very first sedentary farmers in the North Caucasus. Their genetic profile, and I built here on the work of Wolfgang Haag and his colleagues, and I believe them, is virtually indistinguishable from individuals of the Maikop culture in the classical sense, but also from the Kura-Arax culture in the north and in the south. And you can see this in the lower part of the left side. When so the Maikop immigration thus cannot be confirmed by the diffusion of a certain population or ancestry profile, and even not with highly sophisticated biomathematic methods. So when newcomers from the south arrived in the northern slope during Maikop epoch, we would not see them. They would have merged into an existing southern population. And the same applies in the north. The population with steppe ancestry formed in this area more or less. Okay, I'll go here further. Yeah, in the 5th millennium BC, and remained comparatively stable. Also, in this case, immigration or emigration, like for instance Yamnaya movements, can be justified only with archaeological arguments, and the bioarchaeological arguments are less informative. The issue of genetic diversity and temporal depth of the modern Caucasian populations I will not address here. So I have already mentioned that Wolfgang Haag and Aishin Galici have commented on this in a previous ARVA lecture, and I would comment only so far that the Bronze Age situation and the modern situation is very different, and there is still a lot of work to be done to understand both the Bronze Age and the modern Caucasian genomics. A notable aspect in this dataset is that the archaeologically drawn cultural clusters, that archaeological cultures do not correspond with the genetic separation lines, nor do the individual sites, as we do find individuals from both genetic clusters in one mounds and sometimes even in layers, but I will not go into these details here. So just as an example, the Maikop culture, for instance, has a part with a mountainous ancestry in the lower part and another with the steppe ancestry composition in the upper part. They are really different in their genetic makeup. The material culture, burial practice, and other things, however, are not so very different. Generally, steppe Maikop individuals are genetically steppe Maikop individuals are found in the steppe environment. So it would be easy to say, okay, steppe versus mountains. However, there are some also buried in the Piedmont zone. The social structures that produce such a picture, and this is not only the case for Maikop culture, but also for the Middle Bronze Ages, that produce the picture of these kind of populations is still puzzling us, and we are still far from understanding why we do have this before us. No, that's not. So closely related to the question of population movements is the question of the emergence and spread of early infectious diseases. Many of these diseases evolved as zoonosis from intensified human-animal contacts, and it is in fact the study of a recent ERC project headed by Wolfgang Haag, and you see in the lower part their aims of their studies, because they think that diseases could have played a crucial role in the course of history, and I think that's quite right. In a number of recent papers, you can see also the Caucasus as a prominent part study area, and this again revealed the importance of the Caucasus. When we look, for instance, to the disease of salmonellosis, caused by the Salmonella enterica bacteria, we see that these kind of bacteria were obviously present in the Eurasian steppes in the 5th millennium BC. This is a site from the lower Volga, but this was a kind or a type of these diseases which was not human adapted. It could basically jump on everything what came by. The first human-adapted individual, however, what comes from the Ipatwo 3, a big kurgan, from the funding grave 187, which is in fact one of the steppe Maikop outlier by genetics, belongs to the steppe form of the Maikop culture, and in fact introduced obviously or started a development of these diseases, which then really adopted to human population. A second individual from Ike-steppe is, by the chronology, not so very far, and it is on the southern shores of the Black Sea, shore. The development of the Yersinia pestis bacteria in a form which is not transmitted by fleas, so it's not the Black Death as we know it from the medieval period, is first time evident in an individual also from the Caucasus, from Rashevatsky 1, this site, and this individual. You see here the dating. It is associated with Yamnaya culture, and remarkably, this Yersinia pestis genome shows up in this area repeatedly in another site, which is not very far from Rashevatsky, not very far, not chronologically, also not very far. I think that's a difference in mistake in the dating. It's about a little bit younger. It is present in Kalushne here in the late Bronze Age or in the late phase of the Middle Bronze Age, but it is also present in the early Iron Age at the Stavropol Plateau. So somewhere in this area, a reservoir of hosts for this form of plaque had developed, and it remained there until another form of plaque replaced the Stone Age variant. It's noteworthy that bubonic plaque is also represented in one of our data sets in a medieval individual from the Kuban area, and this is not very close from Kaffa on the Crimea, where an important event in the spread of the Black Death towards Europe took place in 1346. So far for the diseases. What about the emergence of pastoralism? In 2012, Michael Facchetti suggested several multi-regional hubs for the development of pastoral economies in Eurasia, in the Central Steppes, in the Eastern Steppes, in the Inner Asiatic Mountain Corridor, and of course in the Western Steppe. And at that time, the Caucasus was rather little studied, so he did not talked to or wrote too much about the Caucasus, and nevertheless he has a Central Asian focus. I think you know that. So the Caucasus, of course, is a very interesting part here, since it is at the interface of Neolithic and Neolithic societies in the south and the Eurasian steppe in the north. Archaeological and botanic evidence in the North Caucasus is unfortunately still very, very sparse. The South Caucasus is much better in this. And the species compositions, which can be read from these very few sites, shift considerably between the South Caucasus in the 6th millennium with a lot of sheep and very few cattle, the 5th millennium in the North Caucasus with a stronger part of cattle and a very strong evidence of pig bones, and a shift towards a spectrum that is dominated by cattle bones in the 4th millennium BC mycop culture. That can maybe maybe adaptation to climatic differences in these areas, but it might also be triggered by some social events or social preferences, I would say. During the last 10 years or 15 years, we have studied the economic aspects of the North Caucasian mountains, pitmans, and the steppe communities in the Bronze Age based on dietary reconstructions of food webs using stable isotope analysis. This was spearheaded by and done by Corinna Knipper, and in a later phase by Claudia Gerling from Mannheim and Basel. And it was published in 2020 and 2017, 18 and 2020 into respective articles. We worked here, in fact, on bone collagen data that inform about the basic food components and stem from the metabolic processes. I think you are familiar with the methods. I will not go into the details. While carbon isotope values reflect chiefly variations in plant compositions between C4 and C4 and C3 plants, and other minor aspects or nitrogen values rise with tropic levels of food change. That means with the intake of, for instance, animal protein, and thus give a more direct estimation of these protein, mostly animal protein, contributions to the respective diets. The main results in these studies are the separation into sites according to their habitat or environment, as you can see here marked on these plots. Individuals from the steppe have significantly higher nitrogen and carbon values, even beyond minus 19 for carbon and above 13 per mil for nitrogen. And individuals that were buried in the more humid steppe or in the foothills with a forest steppe environment or in the mountains have much lower values, which are corresponding with minus 18 to minus 20, 21 per mil for carbon and about 10 to 13.5 per mil for nitrogen. This is quite in the normal range for C3 plant expected values also from other areas. There are some exceptions of post-Bronze Age individuals that have very low carbon values, probably due to millet consumptions, which we have written or proven based on the earlier data set from Tom Heim in the Kislovodsk Basin, where we have a very clear presence of millet consumption from the isotope ranges, but also from the archaeobotanic presence there. These analysis does very nicely fit to Natalia Shishlina's work in the Stavrup or in the Caspian steppe, where her focus was, but also on to her work in other parts of the Caucasus, and the analysis of baseline data from plants, which she published in 2017, which are here the box plots. The boxes here show that the expected values from the from what can be expected from the baseline plant communities, especially for nitrogen, is not necessarily sufficient to cover or to explain all of the observed data ranges. So one consideration of Corinna Knipper basically here was that meat of young animals was consumed that were still in their lacting or still breastfeeding, and therefore they would increase also the trophic level of the human consumers accordingly. All groups, however, must have consumed considerable amounts of protein, be it in the form of diet of meat or of dairy products. And in order to explore the chronological trends with within the major ecozones, we plotted the carbon and nitrogen valleys in combination with the radiocarbon dating. This is a very complicated plot, and I don't want to go into you to go into the details. We see here a first shift in Neolithic populations. This is from the data set of Holland and Heim between the southern Neolithic population and the steppe related Neolithic population, both in carbon and in nitrogen. Then we see a differentiation in the green individuals, which are in fact individuals that are found in the more or less humid forest steppe environments of the Caucasus pitmans and the steppe environment clusters. So also in this we see this divide, and from the radiocarbon data it is clear that by 3500, that means in the mid of the 4th millennium BC, we see the start of this division into the steppe and into the pitman dietary groups, and obviously into two different areas of pastoral exploitation, which did not mix very much. So the isotope data could inform us about the high consumption of animal food resources, but it didn't confirm the dairy products were responsible for that. The processing of and preservation of milk in form of cheese or hard cheese, of yogurt, something like that, however, is crucial to the use of livestock outside of the local settlement environment. And therefore, it is one of the crucial arguments for the beginning of mobile livestock, mobile husbandry, and that means of the beginning of the onset of pastoral exploitation. Evidence for milk use comes from different Neolithic contexts in the 7th and 6th millennium, for instance, from Anatolia and Çatalhöyük, but they stem from vessel content analysis. In order to prove the consumption of the dairy products by themselves, it is necessary to connect the product to the consumers. And that can be done via the dental calculus in which the milk proteins have been preserved. This research, led by Christina Warriner and Ashley Scott, and it's really recently published only, detected milk proteins in 26 out of 28 samples from the North Caucasus. Bronze Age, let's say from the 5th to the 2nd millennium, or to the 1st millennium BC. Unfortunately, the South Caucasus sample proved lower hit rate, but we had much less samples from the South Caucasus, and I think this will be increased with more sample in the future. The species identified were sheep, cattle, sheep, goat, cattle, and in one case from a late Bronze Age individual, even horse milk was consumed. The timeline on the right shows that the distribution of the species has certain vectors. At the beginning, here, this is the North Caucasus, this is the North Caucasus, this is South Caucasus, and this is the start. So the 5th, 4th millennium BC. And at this time, only the milk of sheep was consumed. In the South Caucasus, on the other hand, we see at the site from Alkhan Tepe, we see the consumption of cow milk, and unfortunately, or fortunately, no milk proteomics were detected at the site of Mentesh Tepe, which is a Neolithic, Neolithic samples from the Shomu Tepe Shulaveri phase. But also here, the numbers of the samples were not very much, and maybe future research will change this picture. So who were these earliest individuals with milk positive dental calculus? They stem from the Neolithic and from the Neolithic group associated with steppe Neolithic genetic components. And you see them here on the map. Here they are more or less situated here, and that proves that obviously the dairy technology, so the production of dairy products, was introduced together with the earliest domesticated animals in the North Caucasus, and transferred also via the genetic and the cultural divide of this time into the groups north of the mountains related to the steppe. Dairy was obviously much more interesting for the people than having, let's say, babies with each other, because the genetic still does reveal indeed a heavy or a strict divide between these different populations. During the Mycop period, and particularly in the second half of the 4th millennium, we see an increase in samples, and also an increase in the quantities of the samples, and we see the establishment of, this is the second, but also this individuals belong to the Mycop cultural period complexes, and we see the establishment of sheep milking in the North Caucasus, and we see that on both sides of the genetic divide, in the steppe and in the mountain ancestry subsets, and in the mountain and steppe ancestry cultural subgroups. And one special interesting site is the site of Aigurski too, where we find in a kurgan several individuals, among them one in the center, which was proven positive for milk proteomics in sheep, and another with a kind of, let's say, symbolic herd in form of several astragali of sheep, but also the phalanges of horses and an ass. And these phalanges of the horse proved to be at the onset of the domesticated horses in Western Eurasia, as it was found out by a team spearheaded by Ludovic Orlando, published by Pablo Liberado also in 2021, and that is still a very new information, and it opens the question about the role of the Caucasus in the domestication of horses, but I will also not address that further. Going back further in time, in the early 3rd millennium BC, goats and cattle were added to the spectrum of species which were used for milking, and that was probably triggered by climatic shifts. The studies of Natalia Shishina on the climatic development, especially of the steppe area, revealed the transformation or the slow decrease of moisture, of precipitation, and an increasing aridity that culminated in the 4.2 K event with a very arid climate at that time. And this is probably at the root of the let's say of a hiatus in the exploitation of the steppe after in the 2nd millennium BC, for where we have, however, a very highly efficient semi-sedentary pastoral system in the mountains, which we have studied in the years between 2004 and 2015 in the Kislovodsk Basin, together with Dmitry Korbov and Andrei Belinsky. And we can prove here, in fact, the development from a more or less transhuman exploitation of the high mountain zone prior and in the early phase of the 2nd millennium BC, and a combined mountain agricultural system in the second half of the 2nd millennium BC. And this is the same, it is associated with highly sophisticated stone architecture, and is in fact the same time where in the South Caucasus the several projects, among them the Aragats projects headed by Adam Smith and his team have likewise proven a highly efficient exploitation, sedentary, semi-sedentary exploitation of the mountain zone. And Hannah Shessin wrote her PhD on the archaeology related to that. So summing up these, bioarchaeology or bioarchaeological proxy data add considerably to the information of prehistoric populations and the subsistence practices. But bioarchaeology do not answer all questions, and they provoke many, many new ones. I think that's not surprising that I say that. Bioarchaeology is at its best when integrated in multidisciplinary archaeological projects. It is at its best with a systematic and substantial sampling, so big data and a good dating. And here we can still do very much. Bioarchaeology requires the integration of a multi-proxy approaches, and that is one of the perspectives where we can go into the future. And I will outline this only in one short idea. There could have been many other case or focuses when we look on the development of the use of animals for pastoral exploitation. The proteomics would show us the prevalence of sheep in the 5th, 4th, and also the early 3rd millennium BC. The archaeological evidence of the animal bone spectra, on the contrary, reveal for the 4th millennium a dominance of cattle bones. So the archaeological perspective at that point would have maybe led us astray and thinking that cattle must have played a much more important role in mycob economy than sheep. The proteomics put that to some degrees right. And I will not say that cattle was not a prominent animal in these mycob economies. The stable isotope analysis reveals us here with these individuals cattle that that were obviously outside of the major range of the surrounding sheep and goats, and these cattle were in one case associated with nose rings and probably a yoke, so they were draft cattle. And Corinna Knipper's idea on that is that maybe these animals were trained in more steppe-like areas in the steppe zone, where we have at the same time first evidence for wheeled transports. So piecing together this different information, we can indeed start to color our narratives with more colors than we can we could do that before with the archaeological perspective on the material culture in general. And I will thank and well, the prominence of cattle in mycop culture, I think, is well known. And I thank with this slide from the north and the south for the attention. And I will thank to all friends, colleagues, especially to Andrei Belinsky, Dmitry Korobov, who started with me these things, and to all excavators of the studied sites and the teams of the Bioarchaeological Caucasus and the Caucasus projects, and everybody who commented in the last years on these topics. Thank you very much. And I will go back to the start for a summary in Russian. Дорогие коллеги, которые сейчас в аудитории, у меня очень коротко резюме на русском языке. Я очень рад, что вы меня слышите, и я думаю, что вы тоже часто видели и часто уже читали. К сожалению, мы не могли показывать вот наши результаты последние крупновские чтения, которые были, конечно, самые логичные места для северокавказской археологии. Биоархеологические исследования на Кавказе начиналось с изучения стабильных изотопов на Южном Кавказе и на Северном Кавказе. Самая мощная работа в этом дел сделал Наталья Шишлина. Я думаю, что это вам известно. И ее работа, конечно, на базовой фоне все наши работу. Наша команда продолжала с фокус, который более фокусировали на ареале в горах и в предгорах, и наши результаты показали очень серьезные различия между диетами, между степной и предгорной и горной группе. Это касается всей археологической эпохи, и, по-видимому, это начинается в середине 4-й тысячелетия, скажем, середине майкопского эпоха. Палеогенетические исследования были сделаны последние около лет 10, и первый результат опубликован совместе с командой из Макс Планк института Йена, Wolfgang Hack и Joshua Wang, и это показывало серьезное различие между степной и горной населением в генетическом плане. Горные и предгорные населения очень похожи на южные кавказские, североанатольские и северомесопотамские генетический фон, а северные относятся к степной генетический профиль. Когда это был формирован, мы еще изучаем, и самый главный результат был, что археологические культуры и генетический фон не всегда стыкует. Например, в майкопском эпохе есть и степной генетические группы, и горные или южные генетическую группу, которые не очень отличаются в течение, в районе материальной культуры или погребальный обряд. Почему и как это, почему это так, мы пока не знаем, и мы еще стараемся искать причины, почему такой разный генетический обрыв был между этими населениями, которые жили, в принципе, в одном и том же самом регионе. И они там жили очень долго, потому что вот этот генетические отличия мы видим еще 2000 лет до нашей эры. И последний метод, который я показывал, это протеомик изучение. Это изучение русский, ну, протеомик, протеомс, которые сохранились в супной камень, и их они показывают вопрос, ели и кушали, ели и пили эти люди молоко и молочные продукты, и не только так, а еще показывает, из каких был этот молоко или от коровы или овцы. Самый главный результат был, что мы нашли очень рано уже в энеолитическом группе индивиды, которые показывают такой молочные сигналы, и особенно в майкопском эпохе, второй половины, 4-й тысячелетней, мы видим огромное количество этого протеомик, который показывает молоко. И молочные продукты были изучены и в индивидуе, которые относятся к степном и с горным генетическом фоне, который показывает, что вот этот технологический аспект продавать молочные продукты был очень аттрактивен и был очень важно для открытия степь как habitat для ранней скотоводья. Вообще показывает начало скотоводства. В третьем тысячелетии, ну, начало в третьем тысячелетии, вот эти протеом изучения показывал тоже, что козы и корова была использован для молочной продукты, которые относятся, может быть, с более аридным климатом этого эпохи. И так, вот. И самые главные результаты были, что биоархеологические исследования очень много показывают по культурные и социальные аспекты археологические культуры на Кавказе. Ну, биоархеология не отвечает все вопросы. Самые главные, самые лучшие результаты – это когда биоархеологические исследования участвуют в большие мощные археологические проекты или программы, когда достаточно образцы, которые должны быть хорошо датированы, и здесь можно еще много добавить. И когда вот эти разные аспекты смотрится совместе и посмотреть общий вид из мультипрокси аспекты. И как пример я показывала, что, например, археологические исследования для энеолит и майкопской эпохи на Северном Кавказе, например, скажем, на майкоп, например, могли показывать важность корова в этом крупный рогатый скот, в это экономические хозяйства. А Proteomic Studies показывал, что в принципе люди корову не использовать для молока, использовали овцы. Корова или крупный рогатый скот могли быть использованы для других целей, например, для колесницы, не колесницы, повозки или другие аспекты, и могла быть более социально престижным, чем овец, и поэтому не был использован как источник молочной продукции. И я хочу поблагодарить всем, которые в течение последних 15-20 лет работали с нами, которые копали все эти курганы и которые нам помогли очень с своей информацией и своей открытостью. И поэтому я хочу вас очень благодарить. Спасибо за внимание. Okay, that was it.